The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
I am back, and you are comfortably zoned with me, the Zigzag Man, Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, and it is a terrific day for me. As you know, I speak with some of the most interesting people on the face of the planet. Today is no exception. I have with me he's in Los Angeles right now, originally from New York, a writer, a raconteur, a terrific guy, and a writer of a book on my New York Giants, baseball Giants from way back. Noel Hynd, welcome to the show for the first time, and I'm happy to have you.
Thank you. Very nice to be here, and can't wait to talk to the Giants with someone else who is old enough to remember them.
Oh, yeah. Well, happily and sadly, I think getting old is a privilege because we do have our memories to look back upon, and I'm thrilled to talk Giant ball anytime. You've written a lot of books. How did it come together that you wrote a book on the Giants?
Well, as is quite common for a Giants fan, you can always blame the Dodgers. I first wrote the first edition of the book back in the 1980s, and at the time I was living in Manhattan on 68th and 3rd, and I used to go out to run every day, and I would run in Central Park, and I would warm up near my building, and I would frequently go past an art gallery on Madison Avenue because I would enter the park at the 72nd and 5th Avenue entrance. I would frequently go past an art gallery, and the owner of the gallery had a picture of the 1955 Brooklyn Dodgers in his window. Now, this is, again, 30 years after the 55 people had won their only championship. So I used to go back past that sign, that picture, and I would think, why doesn't somebody write a book about the New York Giants? You know, everybody's forgotten about the New York Giants. They were the preeminent team in baseball and the world for many decades. And there were constantly books coming out, and very good ones, like Roger Kahn's book and Peter Gollenbach's book about the Dodgers. So I had written a couple of spy novels at the time, so I got my agent to talk to some publishers about the prospect of doing a book on the New York Giants, and all the responses came back the same. You know, from publishers, we're not going to hire a writer of fiction to write a nonfiction baseball book. Well, I sort of had that one sitting in the back of my mind for a couple of years, and then one thing led to another, and I started to submit articles to Sports Illustrated on baseball history, and I became a contributor to them. I was not on staff, but I contributed several articles on baseball and a couple of other sports, which they printed. So then about 2 years later, I got back to the same agent. I said, would you go back to the same people, ask them again, and now you can bill me as a contributor to Sports Illustrated. So she did, the agent. And of all places, Doubleday, who owned the Mets at the time, decided, yeah, this is a good project. So we got the initial contract to write the book around 1986 or so.
Nice that you could blend it all together. For those of you who don't know out there, the Mets were owned by Doubleday at one time. And they basically took over for the Giants and the Dodgers in New York. They were what I call an adequate replacement. There was nothing like those days of being either a Giant fan, a Yankee fan, or a Dodger fan and growing up in New York. Couldn't be replaced. The memory of... What was your first experience with the Polo Grounds? Because mine was when I was a little kid, right before Willie got called up, and then right after Willie got called up, my grandfather took me there, and it was like I would say it was a cathedral. Let's put it that
Yeah.
way. We didn't do any praying except when there were 2 strikes in the 9th.
Well, you did hear the phrase "Oh Jesus" quite a bit out there, but
oh yeah, and there were words that came before that as well. Who is? I'll ask you right off the bat. How did you become a Giant fan? When did you start?
Well, when I was a kid, my father, as I said, my father moved the family from New York City to Connecticut in the early 50s, and he was a true crime writer who had worked in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, and he had been on newspapers in those cities, and often he worked on evening papers, and they would wrap up evening papers at maybe 1:30 in the afternoon, and all the reporters would head out to the ballpark. So he had great experience in going to Fenway, Braves Field, Shibe Park, Baker Bowl in Philadelphia, and the 3 New York ballparks. So now we're in the 1950s, and he would always, when I was old enough, as soon as I was old enough to remember, he would have baseball on the tube. And the player who I was fascinated with was not a New York player at all. It was Stan Musial. So I became a Musial. Yeah, who of course owned those right field fences in the New York ballparks, but that's another story.
Right.
So I was a Musial fan. So finally, when I was old enough to be taken to a baseball game, my dad said, "How would you like to go see Musial in person?" Well, you didn't even have to answer a question like that. It was so obvious. So we packed up the car in Connecticut and took off for the Polo grounds one day in June of 1956 to see the Cardinals play the Giants, and that was the first time that I had ever been to a ballpark. I couldn't believe how big the place was. It was a rainy day, so my father said, "This is something special. You see the tarp put on the field, and you get wet all day." It wasn't as special as he was trying to sell it to me at the time, but that was my first trip. I guess it was like June 10th, 1956.
Wow, what a way your dad had of turning lemonade turning lemons into lemonade.
Oh yeah.
Great attitude. Absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Did you become a writer strictly because he was one?
The question could be rephrased as, how did I happen to go into the family business? Yes.
Okay.
Pretty much. In fact, that's a story. It's got nothing to do with baseball, but it's an interesting one. When I was in college at the university, I'd always wanted to write, and let's just say I was not an exceptional science or math student when I was in grade school. Flash forward to around 1968, I'm looking for a summer job. I can't find one. And my father's true crime material has been printed all over the world. He's in his late 60s at the time. And one of the magazine services that published him in Europe got in touch with him and said, "How would you like to write some special reports for us?" And then they said, "We're sorry, we cannot pay very much." It was $75 per article. The articles would be about 6 or 8 pages. So we're in the living room of our home in Westport, Connecticut, and he's got this letter from Oslo, Norway, above the trash can about to throw it out, and he looks at me and says, "Take a look at this. Do you want to do some writing under my name?" And I grabbed it and I said, "Sure." So the next thing you knew, I'd written 4 true crime articles. We sent them in. No internet, obviously, at the time. It was, stand in line at the post office and buy the airmail stamps. And sure enough, they bought them. And I thought, well, this would be a good job for the summer. I kept that job part-time for 18 years.
Wow.
Well past the time that, I'd had actual books published. So that's
now,
how I first paid to write.
Did you continue writing in your dad's name?
that's an interesting story, too. I did, but as he got older, that particular gig graduated to writing for some of the old-fashioned true crime magazines in New York, like Official Detective, Master Detective, and my father died in 1974, and he let the European people in on the idea that his son was writing with him. So my byline, my name appeared with his in Europe. But when he died in 1974, the publishers in New York did not want to let on to their readers that Alan Hynd was no longer writing for them. So for maybe 3 or 4 years after he died, he continued to have articles published by those magazines, and of course I was writing them.
Well, very interesting. Did it occur to you that you were doing something like Woody Allen's Front at all?
Not at the time, no.
Okay.
But I also knew that writing was a strange business, and frequently my father, when he wrote for the American Mercury, for example, in the 1940s, and often he would have 3, 4, 5 articles in one issue, but they never wanted to print a index with the same writer more than once. So he had 4 or 5 pseudonyms. So I basically knew exactly how the system worked.
So basically, they just pay you. You just get a check and you put it into one account that has 2 or 3 different names on it, or well, I'm sure.
The checks would all come to either him or to me. Obviously, after he died, they all came to me. I mean, the people who were publishing knew exactly what they were doing.
Noel, what did he pass on to you that serves you best in life and or writing?
The cynicism of somebody who was a police reporter for 30 years.
Okay.
You could never, and obviously the sense of a good story. Some of his work remains online today. It's available in Kindle and a couple of reprinted editions. I went through much of his work, much of his true crime work over the last few years and republished it. But it was a sense of being able to look, what he would have said would be to able to look at a story with a jaundiced eye, to understand both sides of a story. A lot of the times when he covered a crime story, it was, you were kind of rooting for the criminal. And, for example, one of his specialties was con men, confidence men. And often the con men who he wrote about, the people they swindled really deserved it. There was one guy who stands out, who swindled Mussolini in the 1930s by promising him the availability of something like $2 million American dollars for the Italian treasury, but he would only need like $50,000 for his own services to, get the money transferred. Well, of course, it was a
that stuff is still going on today, exactly the same way.
Yeah, in fact, what my father used to say was almost every con game boils down to where you are blinded by the prospect of gaining $5 or $10 million, and it'll only take you it'll only cost you $250 right here if you give it to me right now, and you will be so wealthy. Every swindle has, to go back to a baseball metaphor, every swindle, the victim eventually takes his eye or her eye off the ball, and all they can see is what they can get, and they don't realize what they're losing.
Well, and greed has to come into it. If it looks too good to be true, it generally is. That's what I find in life.
Yeah. There's something wrong with it. I mean, look at the Madoff stuff. It was exactly the same stuff.
Oh, look at them. They're playing with my team through the Wilpons. I call them the Wilponsies.
Oh, yeah, the Wilponsies. And my nickname for City Field is Madoff Meadows Stadium. but that's just my own thing.
City bunk, how about that?
Yeah.
It goes on and on, but how sad it is that Madoff ripped off, I happen to be Jewish, and he ripped off an inordinate amount of his and my fellow Jews. So,
oh, yeah. Well, I guess it's non-discriminatory.
Absolutely.
Something like that really has nothing to do with it. It's just a con man. I can go up and down the list of con men and crooks. You could have an ethnic all-star team for almost any ethnic group.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. May I ask you, which player, executive, coach, manager did you go to for your first interview when you were going to do a book on the Giants?
Thank you. That's a good question. One of the first, and one of the most memorable, I got Carl Hubble on the telephone in, I guess, around 1985 or so, because I wanted to ask him about I was doing a different article. I might have been doing a different article, but I wanted to talk to him about the famous 5 strikeouts in a row. So I got him at his home in, I think it was Arizona at the time, and we had a wonderful 35-minute phone call, and he was talking about pitching to, all the people he pitched to and how McGraw was an absolute tyrant. I remember Mr. Hubble saying he wasn't just called the Little Napoleon, he was the Little Napoleon. And then I later talked to him about striking out Babe Ruth, and he said, well, let me tell you something about that. He said, those strikeouts in the All-Star game in 1933, I guess it was, no one had ever seen that pitch, that left-handed Scroogey that he used to throw. And so, you didn't have television at that time, so a lot of those guys were seeing it for the first time. And then a year later, Ruth is with the Boston Braves, and he faces Hubble again. And he's waiting for that pitch. And he hits it out at Braves Field into what the players used to call the jury box. It was a section of bleachers out in right field. And Hubble said to me, when Babe came around first base, he looked at me and winked to acknowledge, okay, I know that pitch now. And that's what's going to happen to it. And it was one of Ruth's final home runs, of course.
Yes, he did finish his career with the Braves. And, wow, what a story. Was he nice? Was he cooperative right away, or did it take some talking to get him going? Because it sounds to me like he opened right up to you.
He did. I used to, when I phoned people for interviews like that, I was always aware of their time, obviously, and I would be prepared to talk on the first call, but really the first call was just to introduce myself and to give a number for the publisher if they wanted to check it, and, to arrange a time that would be convenient where we could chat for maybe 20, 25 minutes or so. And he said, talk to me right now. What do you want to know? Take it any way you want, but a lot of these guys back then were just happy and flattered to be remembered, that somebody would still be talking to them. So I rarely had any kind of problems talking to people, and usually the only problem with the interview was you needed to check their recollection, because sometimes the guy would say, well, I remember a game in Detroit, I had 3 hits, and one of them was a home run and it hit the foul pole. And if you went to the library and researched the game, they had inadvertently, their memory was playing tricks on them, and they had inadvertently given me the wrong city or the wrong date or the wrong year. So that was really the only thing I had to be really careful about.
That's incredibly interesting, because on this station we have maybe 6 or 7 Brooklyn Dodger historians. And we have different shows on the Dodgers and what have you. And a while back, we wanted to get an idea whether or not Pee Wee Reese did indeed put his arm around Jackie, and where was it? What were the circumstances? What city was it? And we've talked to authors, we've talked to former players. No one really can say definitively what happened and when it was. There's all kinds of stories. Randy Jackson had one story, Handsome Ransom Jackson, we talked to. Others have other stories. There's no real way of knowing certain things because of what you said. Memory is faulty, and sometimes we have in life selective memory to go with it. You know, we remember the things that stand out, and we embellish them in our minds for so long. Pretty soon it's fiction. So that you are cognizant as an interviewer of that makes for good books. Let me go back a step to your crime writing. Did you ever in life have either the ambition to be a detective, a private detective, a policeman, or a crook? Did you ever fantasize about that? Because the cops and the robbers come from the same neighborhoods. And I don't mean it. Did you ever have any ideas about, wow, you know, this guy's a con? Not that you do it, but did you fantasize about that?
Actually, no. I used to sometimes hear some of my father's off-the-record stories, stuff that he couldn't print in the, 1950s and 60s. And occasionally I would meet some of the people whom he was writing about or listen in on some of the conversations. And basically, I don't know whether I didn't have the nerve to be like that. I just figured I'd lead a happier life if I was not on that side of the crime or crime prevention program. So, no.
Okay.
Writing about it, of course, was something different. However, the short answer to your question is no, never wanted to go there.
Okay, that's good. But you probably did want to be the center fielder for the New York Giants at one time or another in your life.
Oh, if I could have played professional baseball, I would have tried to do it. Yeah, but the hand-eye coordination, much less there's just a skill
it's
level.
the little things that get in the way.
Yeah, exactly. In fact,
the devil in the details. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I had a friend who pitched for Harvard and back in the 70s, and this guy, with a wonderful education, he went to secondary school with me in Connecticut, and he said, if I could have ridden the bus in Class D for a summer or two with all the other guys, I would have loved to have done that. And of course, he had opportunities that the guys in the bus never had. But he, even though he pitched Ivy League and pitched pretty successfully, he never was able to even get a glass of water at Class D.
Yeah, but he dreamt about it, and that's something. And it just gives us an appreciation for for the talent of the players that do get that opportunity. And even the ones, you say Class D, even the ones that don't make it to the majors, you play pro ball. Whoa. Put that in your cap for the rest of your life, and we can think, I played pro ball. How cool must that be? But you know what? How about he pitched for Harvard. He pitched college baseball. That in itself, baseball is something you can take as far as your talents will allow, with no excuses. Some people don't make little league, and I'm gonna cough there because there was a conspiracy to keep me and Marty Rose off the Elm Jack Little League team back then, and 60 years later we both remember it. So there you go. who greased the way for the book for you, made it easy, and conversely, who held you back?
I don't really think, well, nobody really greased the way. Again, the book was called The Giants of the Polo Grounds and was originally published in '88. It went through a fairly routine editing and a very good editor at Doubleday at the time. In fact, there were 3 different editors on the book because the place was sort of in chaos at the time. And really, once the hard part was selling a publisher on the idea. And to some degree, the easy part was the writing. I do remember I got caught on the tail end of a deadline in getting the book in, and in the original edition, I ended up writing something like 30 pages into a typewriter on the last 2 days of the before I had to FedEx the manuscript from Massachusetts to New York. But beyond that, one of the hitches was the publicity department at Doubleday at the time, who basically didn't do anything for the book. It got a wonderful review in the New York Times, and then it was editor's choice for 3 weeks in June of 1988. And then the marketing people did absolutely nothing because the company had been acquired by a German conglomerate at the time, and they basically didn't know what to do with a baseball book. Just recently, with the updated version, which is published now, I basically spent 10 months expanding and revising the book, and I have my own small imprint, so I was able to do a trade paperback and an ebook edition in conjunction with Amazon. So really, there was no blockage the second time other than just getting the time and concentration to do it and do an expanded version. Good.
How does the expanded version differ from what was in the original?
Well, I think one of the faults of the original one, and I got a couple letters like this, was that I went a little too lightly. I went heavily on the early history of the Giants and kind of breezed through the 40s and the 50s. Well, the team was terrible in the 40s, so that was justifiable. But the 50s is what those of us who are still walking this earth remember. So in the revised edition that's out now, I greatly expanded those years, the post-war years with Danny Gardella and Leo DeRocher going from one team to another. And I also was increasingly fascinated by the other attractions that were at the Polo Grounds during those years. Boxing. Dempsey fought there, for example.
Yes, football. The Giants played there. The football Giants played there.
The football Giants started there. There was great soccer. There were great Jewish teams, soccer teams visiting from Vienna in the 1930s. Some of the players stayed and played in the United States for several years. Bella Goodman comes to mind. And then, of all things, there was midget auto racing in the 1940s. They actually put an oval in on the Polo Grounds turf for maybe a week or so, I think in 1948, and you had all of these little cars that were sort of hybrids between Messerschmitts and go-karts zipping around this oval. So it was a fascinating ballpark, and that in the new edition is one of the things that I tried to get into, that the Giants of the Polo Grounds were not just the team, large G Giants, but all of the wonderful people like George M. Cohen and Tallulah Bankhead, and the boxer Sinatra used to turn up for the fights so often.
Sinatra and Jackie Gleason were both heavy-duty Giant fans in those days.
Yeah.
And they talk about it on television. See at the Polo Grounds.
Oh yeah.
The lyrics in Sinatra's song with Ella Fitzgerald about the lady is a tramp had something to do with the Polo Grounds. He said one of them was a Dodger, or Ella was a Dodger fan. He goes, "Ooh, see you in the bleachers," or something like that. Baseball was so big in our society back in the day. They called it the national pastime because it really was. It was before television, and it was the only game in town, if you will. Not that professionals, football and basketball weren't around. They weren't making a dent if you throw in hockey to what baseball meant. And I want you to, if you would, tell me in your research what you got out of the Giant-Dodger rivalry. If you can explain. There are a lot of people listening that have no idea about how fierce the competition. People would be killed in bars for rooting for the wrong team, literally. So can you tell me something about what impressed you about the Giant-Dodger rivalry?
Well, one little funny thing that I've noticed that I haven't heard too many people talk about, back in the 40s and 50s, you had a lot of families where there were a lot of kids, maybe 4 to 6 kids. And when I first had the new book out about the New York Giants, on a couple of radio shows it had call-ins. And there would always be somebody who called in and said, "Hello, Mr. Hynd, my name's Vinny, I'm from Brooklyn, and I'm the only kid in the family who was a Giants fan. And, oh, my older brothers used to pound on me every damn day." And it would go on like that. It wasn't just intra-borough, it was intra-family, and it would be around the dinner table. And it was the guy next door, and not just guys, but women too. I remember people who were just rabid Dodger fans. I don't remember a Dodger fan who was married to a Giants fan. I'm not sure how that would have worked out, but I'm sure it existed. And then the Yankees were sort of off a little bit to the side, but if the Giants won the pennant or the Dodgers won the pennant, who the hell did they expect to be playing in late September, October? The Yankees at Yankee Stadium. So it was just one of those things that it just permeated the whole social structure of New York City in its era, probably from the 20s well into the 50s. The Dodgers, of course, were a weak team up until the 40s, so they didn't have much to crow about. But man, when it got to the post-war, and the Giants and the Dodgers really had good teams at the same time, as did the Yankees. It was something you woke up in the morning, you got one of your 7 or 11 newspapers, and you read your account of your team, and the day revolved around it.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is that when we look back, we really, I was such a Giant fan and Dodger hater. I love the memories of the Dodgers and even the Yankees in those days. When I look back, just as much almost as I do the memories of the Giants, because without the rivalry, it wouldn't have been the same. Without the competition from year to year, and you grew up in New York, I grew up, the first 12 years of my life, maybe 14 years of my life, the World Series was played in my hometown. I thought it was a birthright.
You mean it's not?
Now I have to break it to someone else that had the illusion that it was. I'm sorry. There's also no Santa Claus. And no President of the United States as we know it either. So
I've noticed both of those things, and we're not necessarily the better for either of those things.
No.
If I can just throw a footnote in about the Giant-Dodger rivalry. One of the things that in creating two editions of the Giants at the Polo Grounds, one of the things that happened to me was I gained an immense amount of respect for the guys on the other side, the guys who played for the Dodgers, who were, part part of our memories. And I haven't met that many of them personally, but I know people who have, and they were all pretty decent guys. They really were.
Right.
It was just one of those intense things. I finally just was, when I was finishing off the new edition, I wasn't sure what to do with the dedication, and I dedicated it to the new edition to the living members, the people who this year were alive when I started the book. So there's about 20 people in the dedication of guys like Johnny Antonelli, Tom Lasorda, who played for the Giants or played for the Dodgers, because let's face it, without the other side, it wouldn't have been as intense, and it wouldn't have enriched our lives so much.
Well, speaking of that, Leo DeRocher was the manager of the Dodgers in the 40s, and all of a sudden he becomes the manager of the Giants. We're both not old enough to really remember that transition, but that must have been one hell of a mind-blowing thing for both teams.
The only thing that I've ever seen that really kind of approached it happened in the 1970s in a different sport in New York, where the New York Rangers acquired Phil Esposito from the Bruins and sent Brad Park.
Yes.
Brad Park, who was hated in Boston, to be their defensive replacement for Bobby Orr, who was having injuries. And to just see those people in the other uniform, it was like a bad dream. What's wrong with this picture? Somebody fix it. But DeRocher just...
No, you mentioned writing for Sports Illustrated. In the years when I was growing up, Sports Illustrated in the spring did a photo essay with players in uniforms like I can remember Eddie Matthews in a Houston uniform. Bill Robinson came to the Yankees and changed uniforms. And that article, that yearly article, was really a chance to adjust. I mean, some players just don't look right in certain uniforms. And, all
you have to do is go to Google and Google Babe Ruth, Boston Braves, and take a look at the pictures of the Braves. He's not smiling in very many of these pictures, of the Babe in a Boston Braves uniform in 1935.
1935.
34, yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Not a Red Sox uniform, but the Braves uniform.
Yeah, it's just doesn't look right. That's the only way to put it. Now, were a lot of fans, when Leo took over, were a lot of fans just turned off because of that?
Yeah, a lot of people didn't like him personally. And let's face it, he could be immensely charming, and he could be exactly the opposite of that, using words that I can't use on your show probably. But
you can use any words. This is podcast, and
that's right.
You can use them, but you don't have to really. We understand. There's a book about Leo by, and I know I'm not pronouncing his name, Asensky, I think, is the closest pronunciation, where he just talks about Leo as he really was, a gangster growing up in Springfield, Massachusetts. And he reputed to have stolen Babe Ruth's watch when they were teammates. And from all accounts, he got the crap kicked out of him for that by Babe Ruth. He was a despicable character in a lot of ways, and but the one thing he did, he brought Willie into the game at a very early age. He really tearing up the minor leagues. He comes up to the majors and wasn't succeeding for 20, 30 at-bats. I think he finally got his first home run off of Warren Spahn. And Leo did a job of convincing Willie that he was the center fielder no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to stick with you, and that loyalty paid dividends, immense dividends. He babied Willie, and he coddled him and nursed him, and look what we got, the greatest ball player that ever lived. When I say ever, the greatest ball player I ever saw. Let's put it that way. I'm sure Babe Ruth, if you look at it, if you want to say who is the greatest ball player of all time, has to be Babe Ruth, because he pitched. He had Gretzky-like stats in terms of how he dominated the era he played in. But Willie was the greatest entertaining ball player that ever lived. Let's put it that way. And
as Leo once said, once Leo was asked what's the longest that he ever saw Willie Mays in a slump, and DeRocher said 5 minutes.
Well, Yogi Berra said, I'm not in a slump, I just ain't hitting.
Yeah, there you go.
So, hey, I really enjoyed our first interaction. I hope you will continue to come back from time to time, and let's make this a regular thing, because I love talking to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I'm just looking at the clock, and I thought we'd been on for about 5 minutes, and I think we've been on for in excess of 40. So
that's about the ideal time, I find. Let's have it to be continued, because I have so much more to talk to you about.
Very good. Thank you so much for your time, and it was a pleasure on this end to chat.
This has been a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.